Oh, okay. Welcome back.
Yeah, sorry, I had a wedding last week.
Okay, great. So, should we begin?
Please.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, yeah, we were discussing the Tosas on Daf Beis Amud Aleph. After discussing the Tosas on Yud Amud Aleph, so we're in the middle of the discussion of the status of Nida with respect to Yibo.
Yeah, fine.
Okay, everybody can hear properly, I hope. Okay, so the
Just to be clear, we're talking about Nida the day of the Yibam, meaning Nida is something that will go away.
right, exactly.
So
That's what we're talking about.
it's not a permanent thing. So
So that's
if she's
exactly
in
what we're
Nida,
talking about.
I mean, even Anita could get married, right? You just have to wait.
Yeah,
You shouldn't
exactly.
block the Yibam.
Yeah, so that's what. Let's get back into the Tosas's question. That's exactly the point. That might be the answer. But there's a missing piece to the question, which we discussed last week, but we'll discuss it again in just a second. So this is the question. A woman is again. What happens if somebody is not able to accomplish the mitzvah of yibum right at the very beginning of the process? I mean, at the moment of the misa sabah. Let's say it this way: when a woman's husband dies and he leaves no children, and that's the background for yibum. So at that moment, that triggers what we call a zika. Zika means a strong kesher, a strong bond between the brothers, the remaining brothers, and the wives. If it's one brother and one wife, or multiple brothers or multiple wives, whatever the case may be, that's what we've been discussing. That's called a zika. So what the Mishnah says on Lamed Amud Aleph on page 30a is that there's a principle called Nasr. Let's turn to Lamed Amud Aleph just for a minute, just to get back into the topic. The Mishnah says the following. This is the middle Mishnah on Lamed Amud Aleph. Just for a minute. The Mishnah says, Shlosha Achim, you have three brothers. Shnai mehem nesuin shtei achios. Two of the three brothers married two sisters. So you have Reuven, Shimon, Levi. Reuven and Shimon married Rachel and Leah, and Levi married Sarah. Okay. Rachel and Leah are sisters. Sarah is not a sister. The Echad Nasui Nachris, one is married to Sarah. So Meis Echad Mibali Achios, if Reuven dies, thereby leaving Rachel an almana, and he has no children. The Kines Nasui Nachris es Ishto, and then Levi does Yibum with um, with Rachel, because Shimon is married to Rachel's sister Leah. So the din umesa ishto shalsheni, but then this is the twist. Then the wife of Shimon, Leah, the sister of Rachel, dies after that. The achakach meis nasui nachris, and then Levi dies. Arezu asura olav alamis, ho v'nesra olav sha'achas. That's the principle. So what again, one more time, what happened here? I can give you a simpler case in just a minute, but the case in the Mishnah is the following case. You have three brothers, two of them are married to sisters, and one of them is married to somebody who's not in that family. Okay? So Reuben and Shimon are married to two sisters, and Levi's married to someone from a different family. Reuven dies. His wife cannot be misyavemes with Shimon because Shimon is already married to her sister. So only Levi can do Yibum. But Levi does Yibum. And now Levi is married to Rachel, and Shimon is still married to Leah. Then what happens is that Leah dies, right? And then Levi dies. So when Levi dies, once again, Rachel is a Yibum candidate. Previously, she was excluded as a Yibum candidate to Shimon because because he was married to her sister, but that sister died. So now Shimon, in theory, would be open to marrying Leah because it's no longer a prohibited relationship. The only problem was that from the very beginning, the Zika through his brother Ruvain, at that time he was prohibited from having a relationship with Rachel. So since that is the case, that's what the Mishnah says. That's the last line of that middle Mishnah. It says, Harezu Asura olav olamis, Hoil v'nesra olav sha'achas. So that establishes a principle. Now we want to figure out what the nature of this principle is. What is the principle? That even if the obstacle to Yibum goes away, as long as it was there from the beginning, right? It continues to be Ma'akev Yibum. Because here you have a situation where there was a initial problem in Yibum of Achos Ishto, of his wife's sister. That went away when his wife died, right? But since at the beginning of the Zika, when the Zika started, at the onset of the Zika, there was an erva, even though that erva went away, it doesn't matter. It can never be fixed. Asura la'olamis. So what Tosas is asking, we could take a simpler case if we want to make it just simpler. It's like this. Instead of 3 brothers, 2 brothers. Reuven and Shimon are 2 brothers married to 2 sisters, right? Reuven's married to Rachel. Shimon is married to Leah. Reuven dies. After Reuven dies, a week later, I made up the timing, Leah dies. So after Leah dies, in theory, Shimon would be a proper partner for Rachel, meaning a man can marry his wife's sister after her death. Everybody got that? I said that's what Ariel Sharon did. He married his wife's sister after his wife died. So that is permissible. That's halachically permissible. So here's a situation where Reuven originally could not be miyabim. I'm sorry, Shimon initially could not be miyabim Rachel because he was married to her sister, but then the sister died, so maybe he could be miyabim her now. So the answer is no, he cannot, because that is the same principle, the principle of Harezu Asura olav olamis, Ho v'nesra olav sha'achas. So the question is, how far do we take this? Meaning the principle seems to be that whenever there is an impediment to the implementation of the Zika at the beginning, that even if it goes away, it's not good enough. So that's why Tosas asks, now go back to Tosas on Daf Beis, Amud Aleph, that's why Tosas asks the question, if she happens to be a Nida when her husband dies, so could there be Yibum at that moment? At the moment of the right immediately, could there be Yibum? The answer is no, because Ein Aseh Docha Los Aseh Sheish Bakares. Since this is a not just a lav, but a lav of kares. So therefore, the mitzvah of Yibum will not allow him to go forward. However, as was noted, this is a temporary situation because, after she finishes being Roa Dam, right, and she goes to the mikvah, she's going to be muteris, from that point of view. So the question is, do we apply the same principle of Nasra that we find with regard to Achos Isha to Anida, or is it different? So this is what we started discussing last week, right? And some of you are suggesting, and Jacob's suggesting that now, and I think Andy suggested it last week, and that is that there's a difference between, when something unexpected happens, or at least something new happens that changes the situation. So there, maybe there's a din of Nesra, and you can't recoup, the relationship, because since it was Nesra Sha'achas, it's Nesra Olamis. So that's the case of the death of the wife, which frees up the problem of Achos Ishto, meaning we weren't anticipating that death. And by the way, it has nothing to do with whether or not the person's ill at the time. I mean, the point is that that's not part of the rhythm or the normal function of life. Is not the expectation that somebody will die, within a prescribed, period. And therefore, that is something that is unanticipatable, and by definition is a change. And therefore, for that reason, it is, there's a din of Nasra. However, this is the suggestion which I think we made last week. However, when it comes to Nida, right, it's a, biological, rhythm. And as such, it comes and it goes. We know the patterns. It's just part of the regular, cycle of life, if you will. And as such, maybe there's no Nasra to begin with. So that is one serious possibility. There's a tshuva in the Maram Rittenberg where he says this, actually. But that's not what Tosas says. Tosas gives a second answer. I'm going to get back to the Maram Rittenberg in a second. Tosas's answer, let's look at our Tosas one more time. Don't ask that maybe if she's a nida at the moment of the misa, she should be excluded from yibum forever. She'll become tahar later on, exactly like you're all asking. But the answer is that it's still a problem. Kamo, just like achos ishta she'en mesavemes afilu meista ishto achrechen. In the case of achos ishto, of his wife's sister, even if the wife dies, we still say Nasra Sha'achas Nasra Olamis. Nonetheless, says Tosas, it's not comparable, but not for the reason that we just said, but for another reason. Delodami, the Achos Isha V'Shara Rayos Ha'Isr Omed Ala Yavam Tvei Mishar B'nei Adam Aval Nida L'Kula Alma Asira. Meaning, the difference is, according to Tosos, that the pagam, the obstacle, the impediment, has to be something which is singular to the relationship of this yavam and this yavama. Then we apply the din of Nasra. However, if the if it's a problem just because of her status, and it doesn't apply only to the yavam, it applies to anyone. It would even apply to her husband. So then we don't say the din of Nasra, or then we don't say that it's included in the Mishnah. But before we get to that answer, I just wanted to, since you all suggested the other answer, let me just read you the words from my text. You don't have this of the Maram.
So just how are we coming out? So a Yavam he can't have Yibam with Anita, but in other words, Yibam.
He can't have Yibam with Anita, but the Tsaros, the co-wives, it wouldn't be like Erva, and the co-wives are subject to Yibum. And also, he could have Yibum even with her after she's no longer a Nida.
I just want to be clear. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. In other words, you could marry a Nida and do the Nisuin later, but by Yibum, the whole Yibum is a Nisuin, therefore you can't do it until she's not a Nida. Is that what we're coming at?
Correct. That's for sure correct. Yeah, exactly. Meaning, Kiddusha.
So, in other words, we're worried. In other words, I'm sorry to interrupt. So Yibum, there's no contract by Yibum, right? It's just straight Nisuin, right? There's no.
Yes.
It's not like. Got it. So
I mean, this is actually an argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, but we pass on like Beis Hillel. There's no maimer, what's known like a kiddushin. There's no kiddushin parallel to Yibum Minat Torah, and therefore
there's no
the
documentation.
Real Yibum Daraisa is
there's no ksuba. There's nothing.
What?
There's no ksuba. There's nothing. There's no ksuba.
Well, there is a ksuba. There might be a ksuba you take over the brother's ksuba, or you might write your own ksuba because that's connected to the nesuin. But there's no erusin. There's no kiddushin equivalent. There's just, as you said, a consummation of the Zika, which comes from, her connection to the brother. That's what the pasuk says. Remember, it says
Fascinating.
Yavama Yavo Aleha V'Yibma, right? Ulakacha lo isha.
Ri- Right, and then not to get too graphic, a wedding you have Eidei Yichud. Do you have Eidei Yichud by Yibam? I mean, they can't watch the Yibam, so I don't understand. Meaning you have Eidei Yichud by Yibam, or how does it work? You have an
Something.
Eidim,
Well,
maybe you
that's
don't
a
need
big
Eidim.
question. Whether if you need Adim for the Yibam, which many people think you do, then yes, it would be like
You
Adim.
can't. So only on the Yichud part. Okay.
Just the same way that Isha's miskadeshes begimel drachim
No,
because of
no,
b'bia.
yeah, but right, I'm saying the difference is by
So
Kedushin, there are
what we
other
say
ways to
about the
do
Adim
it.
of Kiddushay Bia, there's the expression that the Gemara uses is Hein Hein Ede Yichud, Hein Hein Ede Bia. The same thing would
Got it.
apply, something similar would apply in the Adim of Yibam.
The
But
difference
of
is that
course,
Yichud does nothing by Yibam, and Yichud by Kedushin accomplishes something. So it's
no,
not
well,
equal.
if the Yichud of the Yibam was it alone, it wouldn't accomplish something. But right, but if they were, if the point was they were
But
consummating.
but but but, but
I'm
right,
sorry.
but even by a Kedushin, but by a wedding, that's not what they're accomplishing, right?
Right, correct. I mean, the Rambam's
Right.
view is that that the yichud has to have that potential, but that's all you need. Right, but I
No,
was
but
talking. I was
there would be a
kiddushin.
purpose for Adam by Yibum if there was a question later on as to whether Yibum actually took place.
Right.
Let's say another brother wants to do chalitza or for whatever reasons. So the fact that there needs to be an Eidei Yichud, let's call it, for Yibum, would have validity.
Yeah, no, for sure. Either or just for a
But,
kiyum.
but yeah. But
Chaim has that.
that would improve they had Yibam, right? I mean, in
No.
other words,
So
one of the
I said I
go
don't want
ahead.
to get
Sorry.
into the principle of it would be the equivalent requirement of what you have in, as I say, kiddushay bia. That's not the same as what we have is kiddushay kesef. And
Correct.
then our
Kedusha Bia. Exactly. I got
yeah,
it.
okay. So that
It'd
we
be
call
like
it
Kedusha
telling you the
Bia.
language
Correct.
that the Gemara uses in Masachet, Kiddusha is hein ede yichud, hein ede bia. But they have to see a certain, kind of relationship, and then for tznius reasons they don't see more, and that's a little bit different than what we talk when we talk about ede yichud at a wedding. There are different views what the nesuin of a wedding is. Is it standing under the chuppah? Is it the badekin? Is it being in the yichud room? So the Rambam's view happens to be that being present in the yichud room is the main factor. But the definition of yichud means that it has a certain there are possibilities. It's privacy, but nothing needs to happen there if that's what you're asking. Correct. But kiddushay bia is a different matter. That there we apply the concept of edekiyum based on a slightly more suggestive, let's say, circumstance. But the details are not important for now. Anyways, this idea that nida is different because the only time we exclude Sarah and exclude Nasra is when there's a relationship problem, not just when there's an action problem. That's what Tosa says. But I just want to contrast that because a bunch of you suggested the other point, which is a predictive or inherent temporary problem as opposed to a permanent problem, not permanent, let's say an unchanging problem until it changes, like the death of the sister-in-law, meaning the wife's sister. So as I say, that is something that we find in the tshuva of the Maram Rottenberg. So where's that tshuva? Let me just get that up for a minute. I'm just going to read you a couple of lines from there. I'm going to read a couple of lines from a few things today. I'm going to get a chance to send them. 1 second.
Just as an aside, if a Kohen Gadol is no longer a Kohen Gadol for some reason, does he still have all the obligations that the Kohen Gadol? He cannot marry an almana or whatever, even if he
Yes, some of those he does. Yes, and some yes, and some no. Yeah,
No,
there's a
because
Mishnah.
according to the concept of Tosfos, if we carry it through, so if the Kohen Gadol was not able to marry to do Yibum, let's say, with his sister-in-law, okay, because she was an
This is the case on the Mishnah on Chaf Amud Aleph.
but later on, let's say,
Almana leKohen Gadol.
let's say later on he was no longer the Kohen Gadol.
Yeah, no, I understand.
So now you could say to Nesra, according to Tosfos' approach, then he would not be able to ever marry that woman again.
Right.
Is that
But as it happens, some of the dinim of Kohen Gadol, even that, this is the question. There's a brisa in Masachet Yoma, last parak. It also appears in Horios about which dinim of the Kohen Gadol apply even after his retirement, which he still might bring the same korban, he still might have the same psulei nashim. There are other things that that require. Rav Soloveitchik used to explain there are two aspects of a Kohen Gadol, or two elements. One is his kedusha, and the other is his minui, meaning one is his formal function. When he retires, he doesn't.
No, because I was trying to find a similar case to.
But it's 1 second. His personal sanctity, having had the experience or the potential of the experience of being nichnas lifnai v'lifnim, that's something that transforms him, and as such, it it really is something that continues to be part of who he is. So the special korban for a Kohen Gadol who is kote in certain conditions, and some of the Dinei Nashim and so on continue even after he's emeritus, if you will. Even though he's not, functioning in the Minui anymore, he still has Kedusha Sagabra. But otherwise, if that isn't true, this is a debate about which details. Then your point would be you'd have another case to think about for sure. But I'll give you some cases that a couple of other Nasra cases that the Rishonim talk about. So there's a tshuva the Maram Rothenburg. It's in the Prague, whatever that means anything to anybody. In the Prague edition of the Tshuva Maram Rothenburg, Tov Samach Vav, meaning 866. So this is the question. Nafla Yavama Lefnei Bachor Echad, not really Bachor, it turns out he's married. There was a Yavama, meaning her husband died, and the Yavam candidate is already married. Shahayan Nasui Isha. He was married to someone. Achakach, then Mesa Ishto. What's the problem? I mentioned this last week.
This is a Nesra case.
So is there Nesra for Cherem Rabbeinu Gershom?
Yeah, she was Nesra originally, at least to Rabbanon anyway. And now he should be able to marry her.
So that's the question. So guess what became like the real kind of test case of how far you push Nasra. This Tosas, this question about Nida, right?
But this is only a Drabanan, not even a Drabanan. It's a
first of all, Cherem Rabbeinu Gershom is not a din daraisa, but the effect of it may be daraisa on a neder level. It's almost like all Klal Yisrael agreed to this. But it's certainly not an Ishus problem, and it might very well be only a Drabanan problem. Anyway, listen to the language of the Maram Rothenburg. I should have copied it, but I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to. Hopefully you'll forgive me. V'ani hayisi savur, I'll try to read it slowly. It says the Maram Rothenburg, she bazeh hayisa mistapkin, that the Shoel is really wondering about the following issue. Shayana sui isha b'shasha naflu lo yivemto. When, the first minute of the Zika at Nesra time, right? He, he's already a married man. V'lo yachal yavma b'pnei Cherem Rabbeinu Gershom, and therefore Cherem Rabbeinu Gershom prohibits him, right? Impedes his ability to implement the Yibum, right? Shehikrim shalolikach beis nashim, that you can't marry two women. The hare einani kari b'shas nefila yavama yavo alecha. Therefore, if the Zika cannot be implemented right away, hare, V'amrina beperik daled achin, and that's the Gemara later on in Yevamos. Kol Yevama she'enani kariba b'shas nefila Yevama yavo aleha. If you can't, if it's Nasra sha'akas, then you're done. Miu hapolig Rabbi Yochanan v'kaimelan Rabbi Yochanan lachim Rabbi Yochanan afilu hachi ein lachush. So not only that, he says, but on the other hand, if you're going to worry about that, why wouldn't you worry about two other things? What are two other things? Imkain kol Yevamos asuros sharei tzrichos lahamtin gimel chadashim v'gam b'pnei ha'evel. This is actually very fascinating, meaning every woman who, in the beginning of her Zika, is an onen and an avela. She's an onenes and an avela because her husband just died. So the moment her husband dies, that triggers the Zika, but she's an onen and she's an avelas. So in practice, she can't get married that moment. So you're going to say Nasra? Moreover, the Mishnah requires what we call havchana. Havchana means a 3-month waiting period. And I think Jacob asked me about this in a different context about a month ago. Right, that's a dindrabanan. Right, anytime you have a transition from one husband to another, there's a havchana period to make crystal clear.
Well, at this point, we could find a way out. We could say, let's say the husband was away for 3 months, or he was sick in the hospital for 3 months.
Okay, so but you would say that in the typical case, that there's that would end yibum. Anyway, it doesn't explain the avelus and the onenes part anyway, right? Because that's right. Automatic. So listen to this. V'Rabbeinu Yakir. This is apparently the German Balitosis were into this question. We'll see in a moment Rabbeinu Ephraim also. Sha'al Yavama Nida B'Shas Nefila Eich Materis Liyavam. So there's a little bit of context. This is where it comes from, right? How come, right? Why wouldn't we say that if she happens to be a Nida at the moment of the Misa or the Nefila, whatever you want to call it, how could she ever be a Yibum candidate? Ha'ein ani korei. It's Nasra, right? So he gives several answers here. One is the tirates mishum drachal darchei noam. We'll see that in Tosas in a few minutes. Sharei yodasi shetifsok v'titaher v'yela heter v'lo tinasei la'acher v'tamtin ad shetisyavim. Number one, maybe the problem of Nasra is related to the principle of Drachel Darchei Noam. This is the second answer of Tosas. And since this is a temporary problem, right? So as a temporary problem, it doesn't compare to the coincidental death of the wife's sister, which solves the problem, but that's totally unanticipated. But here we know the schedule, more or less, of this problem. So in a way, he's throwing in Drachad Darchinom. We'll get back to that in a minute. But that's kind of close to your answer. Then comes a second answer. Odye Shlomar, Iser Davar Acher Goram Lo. Kigon Tesvav Nashim Shepotros Tzaraseim. Avolnida Machmas Atzmahi. Normally, the impediment is a coincidence in the relationship. Namely, just so happens that this wife of the brother is also the sister of the Yavam or the potential Yavam's wife.
It's a relationship problem.
It's a relationship problem. This may be what Tosas may be saying, what Tosas is saying, that it's a relationship problem, as opposed to, Tosas says it a little bit differently. Tosas says, it has to be something that is unique to the Yavam and doesn't apply to everyone. This applies Nida to everyone. The way the Maram Rutenberg is saying it is, this is a problem that has to do with her status, right? Not with it's not a technicality, that like Isser Acher Goram law, the fact that she's his daughter or she's his mother-in-law. Either way, what's fascinating is the Trumas Hadeshen, as I mentioned, I think last week, took Tosas's answer about the relationship. Tosas's answer was, all the cases of error in the Mishnah are relationship problems. This isn't a relationship problem because she's equally prohibited to anybody because she's a nida.
Couldn't we take a different approach?
Just one more second. So the Trumas Hadeshen says, what's the status of a Meshumad? Let's say the Yavam is a Meshumad. What would happen then? So let's assume for the moment, and then you just hold on to your question because I want to get back to it.
Yehudi Yafal Pishachot Yehud. I mean, and
right. So this is an interesting question. This, first of all, just to make it clear, a Meshumad is a person, a convert to another religion, or a person who betrays the Jewish people and identifies with another religion.
Although halachically he's still a Jew.
So this is a complicated question. We learned
he's probably the worst of mummer that you could probably have, but he's still a Jew.
Yeah, so the Rashi has a famous tshuva in which he, based on the Gemara's language, when they tell the story of Achan and Yehoshua, that Yisrael afa pishachata Yisraelhu. Even though a Jew sins, even the worst possible way, by betraying his people and religion at the same time, he signs up with a different religion, right? So even then, he remains a Jew. He can't get away with it even if he wants to. Now, there are some Rishonim who disagree. That's not for now. But that's the mainstream view. However, what's very fascinating is that with regard to Yibum, there are some Gaonim who felt that specifically in Yibum, a Meshumad is excluded. Why? And by the way, they have different discussions about the mace was a Meshumad, the Yavam is a Meshumad, or the woman is a Meshumedes. But why? I'll tell you why. Because here, the Torah, number one, technically, the Torah uses the word Achiv. Ki yeshvu achim yachtav. That's number one. And the idea is that even Afa Pishachata Yisraelu, but that doesn't mean Achicha. Achicha has a more, of course, he is biologically Achicha, but let's understand it in terms of what we've been discussing all year, which is that Yibum is an extraordinary responsibility. It bespeaks of the bond between brothers, and even the bigger the family obligation, the expansive family obligation. When a person marries into a family, right? They're that I should say. When a person marries another person, in addition to that, they are joining each other's families. And Ki yeshvu achim yachdav, right, really highlights that, because the brothers are asked to step in, and she's asked to, bond with one of the brothers for the sake of the legacy of the deceased.
You're not helping the legacy by doing this act because it's going to besmirch the brother's name, not
exactly. So on a technical level, we're dealing with Ki yeshvu achim, not just Yisrael, but even more than that, the whole idea behind Yibum, as we've been discussing all year, is how can we allow a breach of the principle of Eishasach? Doesn't make any sense. The answer is it does make sense, because what normally is an egregious betrayal is an extraordinary chesed of legacy, right? When you're properly motivated, and we're talking about the brothers who are appropriate to this action. But if somebody's a meshumad, he's betrayed the entire Jewish people. Of course, he's betrayed his families. He's the person who either deserves that kind of legacy or is going to provide that kind of legacy for his deceased brother. Or you're going to ask the brother, to bond with a meshumedes, in order to preserve the legacy of his Jewish brother. So there's a debate. Now, even then, by the way, there are plenty of views in the Gaonim and the Rishonim and the Poskim that we still apply the regular din of Yisrael Afa Bishachat Yisrael. However, you can certainly understand why we might be inclined not to go in that direction. How we might be inclined to be thinking that that no matter what the normal status of Mishumad is, when it comes to Yibum, it's excluded. So now what happens in the fall? Let's assume that is the case, according to those Gaonim, whether it's the Yavam or the Yavama, the Mace, it doesn't matter, because once he's dead, right? So, but if we're talking about the Yavam or the Yavama, what if they do tshuva? Everybody agrees you could do tshuva. Is there a Nasra? Meaning, let's assume the Yavam was a Meshumad at the time of the Misas Achiv. And then a month later, he I don't know, he hears a good shir or a good drasha, or he goes to one of these kiruv places or whatever it is. Whatever it is, he Baruch Hashem, he finds himself.
You can ask the same question with Edus.
What do you mean, Edus?
If the guy is puzzled for Edus because he's a Russia, but he did tshuva afterwards.
Right. He could do tshuva and regain his status as an aid.
Okay, so then the same thing should apply here.
Yeah, no, he can certainly remove the he can remove the stigma of being a meshumad. The question is there a din of Nasra? Meaning, at the time of the Mitzvah.
How come by Edus you don't say Nasra?
What?
How come by Edom you don't say Nasra?
What do you mean?
The guys are Russian.
There's a Yibum concept.
No, but it's only by Yibum Nasra?
Only by Yibum.
Isn't Nasra a general concept that if something is also
not necessarily? I mean, you have to look at
the machlokus, I think, with that. No, but I mean, there is an opinion that
no. I mean, it might apply in some other area, but this idea of Nasra in particular, there's an interesting. I mean, Rabbeinu Peretz implies that there's a Gilui Milsa and Yibum about it. That others think it's just part of the definition of Yibum that makes the moment of Zika the critical moment. The Rambam in Pirush Mishnayos has a possibility that the whole din of Nasra is only Drabanan. Bali Tosis, and we just saw a second ago, have a view that it's all based on Drachel Darchei Noam. So there are different views, even in Yibum, what it's based on and what its status is. But it's certainly unique to Yibum. Whether there are any parallels, there are in some cases parallels, but it's definitely not a din in Kol Torah Kula. Meaning in Edus, for sure, if a person does tshuva, meaning the Rambam Hilchos Tshuva outlines exactly, based on the Gemara in Sanhedrin, the third parak, exactly how you neutralize your psuledus and become a kosher aid again. It's tshuva, but it's also finding yourself in a situation comparable to your Aveira, things of that sort. So there's no question that you can rehabilitate your status as an aid, but rehabilitating your status as a Yavam or Yavama gets you into the question of Nasra. So the Trumas Hadeshen, listen to this, discusses this problem of Nasra in Mishumad, and what he says is, guess what he quotes? Nida. It's just so interesting how this question, testing the parameters of Nasra, just has so much impact. So he says like the following. He says, what does Tosas say about Nasra, really, in the first answer? Tosas says, if it's particular to the relationship, then it's a Nasra problem. But if it's something across the board, then it's not a Nasra problem. That's why Nida is different from the other Erevas, right? Says the Trumas Hadeshen, that's true about Meshumad too. The problem of Meshumad is not a problem only for one Yavam. It's a problem for all the potential brothers for Yavam. Not only that, the status of Meshumad, actually, it's a little bit of a tricky question. Because if it's not din, the normal din of Meshumad and Kol Torah Kula, right? Actually, there's more of an exclusion for Yibum than there is for any other marriage. But at least vis-a-vis the other tsaros or brothers, it's not about. The point isn't about the relationship. That's for sure. It's about or to use the language of Ram Rutenberg, it's a problem in her or in him, not a problem coincidentally in the convergence between them of a relationship. Says the Trumas Hadeshen, according to Tosfos' view of Nida, hu adin mishumad. However, However, if you look at the Rosh and the Tosas HaRosh, they read Tosas differently. They add the following words. I'm going to read Tosas HaRosh because it's clearer. Tosas HaRosh says exactly what our Tosas says, except that he adds a couple of words. What are the words that he adds? Just one second. Let me get them. Oh, this is the language of the Tosas HaRosh. Aval nida lekula alma asura, velo mikri erva de'ena asura mishum kurva. So the ena asura mishum kurva is like what Tosas is saying, meaning it's not a problem of incest, they're too close to each other, right? The problem is applicable. It applies to Kishar B'nai Adam, to all people. But the Tosas HaRosh adds one sentence, or sorry, not a sentence, 3 words. Velo mikri erva de'ena asura mishum kurva. Unlike the Trumas Hadeshen, who thinks that the distinction in Tosas between a relationship problem and simply an Isur to everybody across the board, that's not how the Rosh read Tosas. The way the Rosh read Tosas is that this is something unique to the status of Nida as an Ereva. Meaning, going back to what we started discussing last week, which is Nida is Chayve Krisis. Nida in the Torah is called Gilei Arayos in Parshas Achremos and in Parshas Kedoshim that we just
in the Parsha of Erva.
What?
It's in the Parsha of Erva.
Yeah, in both Parshios, 2 Parshios of Erva. One is in Achremos, the other is in Kedoshim. In both, Nida is included, and Nida is termed Gilei Arayos, the Gila Servasa, right? So is Nida, on the other hand, as we noted, there's Tfisas Kiddushin for Nida, right? Jacob mentioned that earlier. Like, if he's Mekad, I'm talking about Kiddushin, what about the Nisuin for the Rambam? That's a different story. But the Kiddushin is Chal B'Nida. That's the Gemara here in Yevamos on Mem Tes Samad Aleph, and the parallel Gemara in Kiddushin, Daf Samach Zayin.
But by the way, if he'd been miyabim the nida, would it be work with the Evid?
So that's the next day in
The whole
Tosas.
question.
That's a great point, because since it works in Kiddushin, maybe it should work in Yibam B'Di'evet, right?
Right.
So the answer is let's read one more line in Tosas. That's the next line in Tosas.
Okay.
But that's an argument. But I'm just going to read it anyway since you brought it up.
What's the other side? Meaning
I'll
they
explain
did
in a
have
minute.
a bia. Okay.
So, but what you just said is the next line. Ve'afilo b'nidasa, meaning he's not allowed to do yibum. But if he did do it against the rules, mashma b'psachim so perak eludvarim debas yibumi, that it would work.
Well, wait a second. Wait a second.
1 second. Just give me one more second.
Of a nida does
What?
not necessarily require a physical act. So he hasn't the kedushin, not the nisuin, the kedushin of a nida in a regular marriage doesn't require a physical act. Yibum, he's
that's a good point, except for one problem. Let's say he was Mekadesh Anida with a Maisa Bia.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
The answer is that, as far as we know, that also is Kal.
That works. But that works. Everyone agrees that works?
Yes. It's also.
No,
it's
but
prohibited,
what
but
I
it works.
understand, the one that says Yibam doesn't work, how does he say the Kedushin works? How are they different?
Ah, okay. Good. So I think, but the first day of Tosas assumes that it doesn't work. Otherwise, it could never be Nasra. They couldn't even ask their question, right? So the assumption of the first day of Tosas is that it wouldn't work even if you did it. What do they do with the Gemara and Pesachim that they can approve? So the Rashash and others suggest how they get out of the Gemara.
I'm just surprised that nobody.
But he did. Jacob asked a very excellent question, and that is, it really should work b'diavad because it works in there's tfisas kedushin. So why shouldn't the yibam be chal? So my answer to that, according to the first view,
Well, we're much more strict with Yibum because it's
Guys,
off
you
the
don't need
track.
me. You could just do this on your own. But that's exactly the point. All year long, what we keep seeing again and again and again is an interesting, debate about Yibum and its standards. Are the standards of Yibum less than Kiddushin or more than Kiddushin? Less because number one, all you need is the Nisuin part. Number two, we're so makel to begin with lahakam la'achav shamely, so we're being matir an eshasak. So we really want to make it, we want to enable this. We want to make it possible, right? And the Gemara even thought that.
Except we have the shadow of Abba Shul over us, telling us you better be very
On the
careful.
other side, we have this Abba Shol idea which is,
Right, you have to have the right
sure,
intentions.
we want you to do Yibum, but we want you to
But
do
even with
Yibum.
Abba Shoel, 1 second, Abba Shoel just says you can have the right intentions and still do it with Anita. And it's not about intentions. Whereas Abba Shoel's about your intent.
Right. We're using Abba Shol as an example. We're not
Only to
saying
show
that
how strict one has to be.
right. What we want to show is that through Abba Shol is that there are even though there are tremendous kulas associated with Yibum, there are also some tremendous chumras. And the idea of an ishus lishma, like when you get married, kiddushin, right? If you want to say, "Oh, I'm marrying her l'shem noi," I'm marrying her because she's a great wife. I'm
It,
marrying
so to
her
speak, is a slippery slope that you have to very carefully navigate, or everything can blow up in your face.
Yeah. But the point is, if what you see from Abba Shol and other things is that the Yibum is highly sensitive, we are going to be Mekil, but we still want to ensure that it's an Isha's Shel Kedusha. So maybe the first view of Tosos, to answer Jacob's very good question, which is Nida won't work even if you go ahead and do it, even though it would work for Kiddushin. Why should it be more strict? After all, we're being Mekil, we're being Matir Eishas. If you're Makadish and Eshasak, it's nothing. But if you're Bayabim the Eshasak, the answer is
we don't want to create the aura of a free-for-all.
We don't want it to be, to use the language of Abba Shol, we don't want it to be Karav La'erva. So the point is, it may be that maybe the standards are lower in some things, but they're higher in other things for the same reason.
Yeah, but even if it's higher, that doesn't explain. So if someone's Makadish does Yibum with Anita, then he has to separate from her forever. Like what?
No.
It didn't work.
What
now
we're saying is that the act of Yibum with a Nida wouldn't create the Kinyan Yibum. Even
right,
though,
so I'm saying
even though the act of Kiddushay Bia with the regular Isha b'di'eved, even though you did the Aveira, you don't get a pass on the Aveira, but it's not Ma'akev the Kinya.
I thought there's a mandama that says that it doesn't work, b'di'eved.
What?
If you do Yibum with Anita, it doesn't work.
Right, these are 2 days.
The second day. According to that day, then what? Then you have to wait and then do it afterwards?
No, so that depends on the first question, that the first thing.
Nesra.
That depends whether Nesra applies or not. I mean, first
she's also forever now?
That was Tosas's question, but Tosas said not true.
By the way, this would get very complicated.
Tosas's conclusion in the first answer is that she's not excluded forever. She'll be muteres once she's no longer a nida. But if he was ba'aleha b'nidasa, that would not work.
Meaning forever. He's banned forever.
No, not banned forever.
This would get very complicated.
It didn't work. You just do it again.
You could do it again, but you have to do it again after she's no longer a nida.
Yeah, but this would get very complicated in the cases where we have some cases where you only allowed one bia in Yibum.
If it was also, this is chayve krisis, it's worse in a way.
No, but I'm saying we have certain
Those are cases of heter. Because it's ase dochalos ase.
Oh, but if he had a situation like this, he couldn't wait afterwards to be miyabim because he lost his one, he only had one opportunity in the, according to...
He is miyabim, the kinyan yibum is kal, just ask a divorce, that's all. But that's an ongoing problem. That's chayve lavin. She's an almana l'kohen gadol. She, something like that.
I'm just wondering, maybe I'm off the track completely, why there wouldn't be a simpler approach to why Nida should not be a problem of Nesra. The Torah goes to all kinds of extremes to show that the idea is to step into the shoes of the brother that died.
The
point that the ksuba of the old brother, at least according to some, is the ksuba that she inherits.
Yeah.
So if she was good enough for the brother to remain married to her while she was a nida, if he's stepping into the shoes of the brother, then he should be okay also. The Nesra shouldn't apply.
I wouldn't say it that way. What I would say is that, like Tosis is saying, you see that it's not a relationship problem because there's nida in every marriage.
But here it goes even one step more. He is actually the brother. All right. And since the brother,
right, but to be fully the
could
brother,
remain married to her, even though she was a nida.
Right. But in order to be the brother fully, more than a zika, he has to consummate the iba, and he can't do that because it's chayve krisis. Right. The question is, if he did it, even though it was asur, and even though he gets that punishment, whether it works or not, in the same way that it works in bias kiddushay nida, or the standards here are even higher, because even as it's a tremendous kula, it's side by side to maintain the character of kedusha is a tremendous chumrah. That's the question. Okay, but this idea of the Rush, the way the Rush is reading Tosas, the question of relationships is an erva issue. It doesn't necessarily apply to a meshumad. Maybe meshumad is a different story. Maybe a meshumad is always not an appropriate partner, and there's a stigma, and therefore maybe there is an Esra. I'm just pointing out that the printed Tosas says nothing about Nida not being an Erva, but the Rush, and I'll show you in a second, Rabbeinu Tam and the Ravon, they all add a line to what Tosas says and say that Nida is not really Erva. Okay, so let me quote Rabbeinu Tam and the Ravon, but it's interesting. Each one points to something different. The Rush says, "What do you mean that Nida is not an Erva?" Because it's not a korva problem. It's not like an incestuous relationship. It's just her status at the moment. What does Rabbeinu Tam say? Listen to the language of Rabbeinu Tam.
It's not even that. That's part of the normal cycle. I mean, how could you say it's meaning?
Right, exactly.
That's how Hashem made it. I mean,
that's what he means. So listen to this. This is Rabbeinu Tam and Sefer Yashar. It's in the Tshuvas of Sefer Yashar, Siman Ayin Tes. This is an exchange with Rabbeinu Ephraim Regensburg. This same Rabbeinu Ephraim asked the same question to the Ravon. We'll see in a moment. They were all like obsessed with this strange case of the Nida. They saw it all as a test case. It was so interesting. And the Ramban and the Rambam, they don't even talk about it at all because they don't think they think it's so obvious. Just like some of you think it's obvious. Oh. So this is the language of Rabbeinu Tam. He was asked this question by Rabbi Ephraim ben Yitzchak of Regensburg. And he says, Anu Mefarshim, Ma Achos Isha, again, the question, what's the relationship between that and Achos Isha? Mucheda Shehi Erva. Achos Isha is an Erva. La Fuke Nida. Meaning Nida is not an Erva. Afal Gav, but at least the Rabbeinu Tam addresses the question. Tichsivba b'vayikra yodches el isha b'nidas devasa tumasa lo tekariv legalos ervasa. Meaning the Torah calls it an erva. That's not a small thing. Says Rabbeinu Tam. Ein a Talmud kore erva ella delotalia biyomi utvila. Rabbeinu Tam says it's true that it's in Parshas Achrei Mos, and the Torah uses the expression of erva, but for our purposes legally, more important is that the Gemara never calls it erva, and the Gemara doesn't think erva applies to something that is tolui biyomi utvila. What does yomi utvila mean? It means you just have to wait it out. Like you all said. You wait till the dam stops flowing, the menstrual blood, and then there are several days to wait, and then there's a tefillah to accomplish. But that's not erva doesn't wax and wane. Erva is a status. Anything that's totally biyomi tvili is not a status. It's not a personal status, right? It's a circumstance. It's a
situation.
Yeah. But listen to another one of his proofs. This is really interesting. Because Rabbeinu Tam's going full in. He's troubled by the psukim, but he has a strong conviction. So he's looking for other evidence. Look what he says. V'chein ein davar shebe'erva pachos mishnayim. V'ein chazakas nida b'chlal v'lo svirasa. Wow. Last year we discussed this question, the problem of Eidecha Neman B'Yisurim, the difference between davar shebe'erva ein pachos mishnayim and Eidecha Neman B'Yisurim. Right? So when it comes to nida, she's believed that she's not a nida anymore, or that she is a nida. Based on her, we believe her based on what she tells us. She's nemenes. What happened to the principle of ein davar shebe'erva pachos mishnayim? Says Rabbeinu Tam, that's another proof that nida is not really an erva. Is that really such a good proof? Well,
in a practical situation,
ein davar shebe'erva pachos mishnayim might mean a change, a maisa erva, or a change that creates a change in her status. Like a kiddushin or a gerushin, that's where we apply the din of ein davar shebe'erva pachos mishnayim, right? But even if nida is an erva, it's like saying
you have a bori and a shema. I mean, there's nobody.
Let's say Eidachod were to come. Let's say Eidachod were to come and say in court, this woman is his mother-in-law. That's what we call Eidus HaKol.
You have a contested situation. There's no contested situation.
Or not contested, but Eidachod is Neman B'Yisurim, meaning that's called what we call Ishtimo De'inhu. That's the Gemara later on in the Yibamos. Let's say you have somebody comes to court and they says, how do you know this is the guy's brother for Yibum? Can Eidachod establish that? Can an Eidachod establish an identity that has impact or implications regarding erva?
Doesn't it make a difference if anyone's contesting it or not?
Might, but the Rambam has a famous, as we discussed last year. The Rambam in Perek Tezvav, Hilchos Sanhedrin, and in Shkagos and a few other places, has a very interesting compromise in that. Ram says, Huksa kadavar b'eidachad. He says it depends on the order. Like if an eidachad comes to court and he says this is chaylev, and then the other guy says, I want to eat it. If he eats it after the Eidachod already established it as Chalev, so he gets Malchus. But if the Eidus was if he ate it already, and then an Eidachod comes and says, he ate what he ate was Chalev, and he knew about it, says the Rambam, if that was the order, we'd require 2 Eidim. Because the Eidus in that case is Mitzurif to the Maisavera, not to the identity of the Chefza. Understand?
Even if he would admit, you would still need to aid him?
No. Or let's say he didn't believe it. Let's say he said, I don't believe it's Caleb. Right? But he was given Asra. He said, I don't believe you. Something like that. Or he'd say he didn't know one way or another, but he didn't want to believe him. Anyway, my point is it a good proof normally the typical standard view of Ein Davar Shemer Pachas Mishnayim means you need Edom for Kiddushin, you need Edom for Gerushin, you need Edom for Maisesnos, not necessarily for identification. So that isn't such a strong proof, but it's still, we can see why Rabbeinu Tam, but then Rabbeinu Tam goes on to say, I'm not going to read it inside because it doesn't really matter so much, but you get the basic idea, without reading it, and that is, Rabbeinu Tam says, look around Shas. in the end of Masachet Kiddushin, several Gemaras in Yevamos, you'll see that mostly, whenever the Gemara discusses the relationship of the standards of Nida and other ervas, it doesn't call it Nida and erva. It's based always on a hekesh. But when they discuss internally relationship ervas one to another, different standards, they always say, oh, they're both ervas. Rabbi Tam had a very he read the Shas with a magnifying glass. But what comes out is very strange. It's like Rabbi Tam is saying, don't bother me with the language of the psukim. I'm telling you what I see in the language of the Talmud. Talmud is is a conceptual, book. It wasn't even supposed to be written down.
Talmud was supposed to interpret the Torah, not to not
Right.
be in place of the Torah.
So this goes to something I've argued in the past, and that is that the Bali Tosos, this is not true always, of course, but compared to the Rambam, as I'll show you in a minute, Bali Tosos are look at limudim and the language of psukim more as a source of information than as like a conceptual determinant. And the Rambam, the opposite. The Rambam always thinks that where something is, what the language of the pasuk is, what kind of drush of method of darshaning is. That's the Rambam's view about Divrei Sofer. That's why the Rambam sometimes, picks his own limudim. The Rambam is super hypersensitive about the, formulations
Or
and
about the
location
system with the
of
Rambam.
Torah Shebechsav. He doesn't just see it as like a means to provide some information. To him, it's like the conceptual. I always joke. I say, like, for the Rambam, Torah Shebechsav is the best conceptual, basis for interpreting Torah Shebaal Peh. Usually people say the opposite, but for the Bali Tosis, it's the opposite. It is the opposite, meaning the Torah Shebechsav provides, the means that the Rebbeinu Shalom revealed the Torah, but not necessarily does the language always determinative if the Torah Shebaal Peh understands it in a different way. It's a very fascinating thing.
The
Well, you'll see
Rambam basically is concerned that the system be perfect, and he's not that concerned about the exceptions that may be floating around. The Bali Tosis are very focused on any.
Well, the Rambam is very holistic. Remember, his view is called Torah Kula. The Yad HaChazaka has every single halakha in a closed system, So I don't know. I don't agree with the first part, but I do think that there's a difference in orientation. Let me show you the Ravan was contemporary, and he also was asked the same question by Rabbeinu Ephraim. So actually very interesting, because our discussion in Tosa, our printed Tosas, about Nida is on Beis Samad Aleph. Again, we've been discussing, the Gemaras on Daf, Gimel and Dalet and Ches and Yud and Yud Aleph, and we're going to go back to Yud Aleph, in our next topic. But we went back to Beis Samad Aleph because that's what Tosas raises this Nida question. The Ravan discusses it at the very end of the Masechta, Kuf Yud Aleph. He talks about Katan. He says, look, in a katan is miyabim, that should be a Nasra problem because he can't be koneh and he can't be make him zera right away. So why don't we say Nasra? Says the Ravan, because the katan you just have to wait it out. He'll grow mimela. Afagav delav bar hakim shem, who hashta the katan who, hol v'chigodil have bar hakama, karidan yavami avaleha, ve'ena nesra.
How can he work it out if it's a Nesra to begin with?
Say again?
How can he wait it out if it was Nesra already to begin with?
No, that's what they're saying. But since it's a natural wait, you don't have to do anything. Oh, so then he says, Hachanami yavama shahisanida. That's what motivates him to talk about it at the end of Masechta, because that's where Katan is. Says the same is true for Yavama, who is a Nida, B'shas Nefila Liyibum, V'lamotzi Ba'aleha, and therefore at that time there's no way to accomplish the Yibum. Hol L'shatitvel Karina Yavama Yavo Aleha, though, Ein Aseres, like you guys said.
match Tosfos's answer. Tosfos's answer was that
Not Tosfos's answer. But then he adds another answer. The ode, the lodami nida l'shara rayos. The shara rayos lo tafsibu kiddushin. The nida tafsibu kiddushin. So interesting, meaning the Rush wanted to say that nida wasn't erva. How did he illustrate it? Because it's not a korva problem. It's not an incestuous relationship. When Rabbeinu Tam wanted to establish that nida is not an erva, how did he explain it? If it's yomi, if it's subject to yomi utvili, then it can't be an erva problem. When the Ravan wanted to explain why nida wasn't a yibam, wasn't an erva, what did he explain? The answer is the Tfisas Kiddushin.
but that doesn't apply to Yibum.
No, he's saying it does. And
Also,
then he goes on to add,
he's holding that by Yibum it's okay. It's valid.
so that's the next line. The first thing he says is, listen, because it's Tfisas Kiddushin, that proves in general that it's not an erva. And then he adds, and as it so happens, there will even be Tfisas Nida b'diavad because of the Gemara Psachim, like our second day of Tosas. But without that, he still would say what he's saying because he's trying to prove that Nida in general is not an erva.
by definition.
Yeah. So let me contrast this. I'm going to stop in a minute because our time is almost running out. Let me contrast with the Rambam. I keep saying that the Rambam, has a different perspective in some of these issues in general, about Torah Shabbat Sab. I think that's mostly true with some exceptions, of course. Nothing ever works out perfectly. But with regard to Nida, I think it's very, very striking that the Rambam again and again and again, whenever he talks about Nida and especially the exceptions that distinguish Nida from other ervas, he always says Afapisha Nidahi. So, for example, in Perek Dalet Halacha Yud Beis in Hilchos Ishus, that's where he says that Kedushin is Chal. Right? If the Ravan was writing Perek Dalet Halacha Yud Beis, he would have said, you can't be Mekadosh and Erva. The Kedushin is not Tofes, but you can be Mekadosh and Nida because in the case of Nida, she's not an Erva. That's not how the Rambam says it. How does the Rambam say it? Hamakadesh achas min arayos lo asaklum. He doesn't say Hamakadesh achan b'chayvi krisis lo asaklum because he's worried about Nida. He says if you're Makadesh and Erva, it's a waste of time. It's not binding. She'ein kiddushin tovsin be'erva. Chutz min anida. With the meaning the chiddush here in the Rambam
He is including the Nida as an erva. He says chutz
exactly. That's what I'm trying to show. Unlike the Balei Tosas, because otherwise it's not erva chutz min anida. It's because she's not an erva. The way the Ravan said it is she's not an erva. That's the proof. Shamakadish anida harezu mekudeshes kedushin gemurin. But then, by the way, he adds the ein roy lasos kain. This is a bit of a mysterious line in the Rambam. What do you mean ein roy lasos kain?
I mean, it's only a b'diavad, no?
No, it's only b'diavad. But even as a lechatchila not to do it, where does that come from?
It's not the nice thing, whatever. It's not the
So
highest,
the Nosa Kalim,
highest level of behavior.
Let me say it this way. This line, ein roy lasos kain, comes from the Rambam, not from the Gemara. The Gemara says that that Kiddushay Nida works. The Gemara doesn't say anywhere that you shouldn't do it, lechatchila. As far as I know, the earliest one to say this is the Rambam. So the Nosa Kalim, most of them say.
I mean, it doesn't have to say it because it's an Isser, as you said before.
No. Kiddush. I'm not talking about bia.
Oh, Kedushin. But we said before that Kedushin could be bia.
Yeah, but let's say normally when you say Makadosh, so then he should have said that. Of course, you can't be. You shouldn't be Makadosh bia. That's clear. So, but a lot of the Nosa Kalim say that the pshat is as follows. But I'm not sure if it's correct. I'll just say what they say. What they say is technically, what happens when you're Makadosh with Kesef? So you tabas, or you give the woman the money, or they give her the ring, right? or you put it on her finger, correct? But if she's an Isha Nida, there's a Negia problem. So many of the
You can make a shliach to put it on a finger, no?
What?
You can make a shliach to put it on the finger. Shliach has the same problem.
Yeah, that same problem. But it's maybe there wouldn't be derech hiba. But the point is that, in other words, many of the Nosei Kalim interpret this in a very technical way. That's really what I'm trying to. V'yesh misha kasav shetavu Rabbeinu Kanu shema yiga b'bsara. That's the Maggid Mishnah. However, I have two other theories to share. One is that maybe this is l'shita. So we mentioned before that the Rambam holds in regular ishus that the nesuin is yichud haroy labia. That's the Rambam in Perek Yud, Hilchos Ishus. That's his unique shita. So since the Rambam thinks that the definition of chuppah is yichud haroy labia, maybe what he's saying is, even though the kedushin are chal, it's a kedushin which cannot be immediately, followed up with nesuin. And even though you can separate kedushin and nesuin, but the point is that the opportunity to integrate them is lost in the case of kiddushin nida. That's one possibility. I think another possibility, and this I'm just speculating, it's my personal speculation, is that the Rambam is l'shitaso of this bigger issue, which is nida really erva? So what the Rambam's thinking is, it's true, this is an erva this is an exceptional erva where there is tfisas kiddushin. But as you said, in Roy Lassos came, because it's still kiddushay erva. So forget about touching the finger and forget about the continuity between Erison and Nesuin. It's like a pasnish kind of a thing, like you said. But for this reason. But if you didn't hold like Rabbeinu Tam, I'm sorry, if you held like Rabbeinu Tam or the Ravan or the Tosarash, it's not that this is an erva, exception. It's an exception because it's not erva. So what's interesting is, number one, earlier in Perek Aleph Hilchos Ishus, the Rambam makes a big deal of what's included in Parshas Achrei Mos. Also very interesting. He says, Perek Aleph Halacha Hey Ishus Kol she'asar biyaso b'Torah v'chayval biyaso kares deheinu amuros b'Parshas Achrei Mos heina nikroim arayos. Halachas mehem nikras erva. He doesn't mention nida, but he says anything in the parsha of Achrei Mos is an erva. And of course, we know that nida is in there. So I'm going to give you one more before we stop, and then I'll let's finish this up and talk about Drachei Darkei Noam next time. But one more just for a minute, and that is when the Rambam in Perek Dalid of Hilchos Isurei Bia, Halacha Aleph, talks about nida. Listen to the language that he uses. Hanida Perek Daled Halacha Aleph Harehi Kishar Kol Hoarayos. That's how he introduces it. And when the Rambam in Perek Tezvav Hilchos Isurei Bia, Hanida Harehi Kishar Kol Hoarayos. That's Perek Daled Halacha Aleph. In Perek Tezvav, when he talks about mamzer, there's no mamzer from nida, even though she's an arayos and a krisus. Same reason that there's tfisas kiddushin. Ezu mamzer omer batorah ze ba mi erva min arayos chutz min anida. So the Rambam, and there are a few others. There's one in Yisrael Mizbeach and one in Zona. There are several other Rambams, and some in Pirush Shayas. As far as I know, the Rambam is always consistent, and even when he is speaking about the, unique dinim of nida vis-a-vis other ervas, he always says afapishu erva, afapishu erva, or chutz erva, chutz min anida. It's so different from Rabbeinu Tam, the Ramban, and the Tosarash. Now, again, when it comes to Yibum, the Rambam doesn't discuss the whole problem, because for him, if there's Tfisas Kiddushin, generally, there's Zika. That's the Rambam's Shita that we saw already. But this is basically the argument between the Rambam and other Rishonim. So I want to do next time is the third view. The third view in Tosas, we'll just finish with this now, is Tosas says, second. V'od nira l'chalek, da'achos isha afa bisha mesa isha ishto achrechein. Right? The difference between nida and achos ishta is that even if the wife's sister dies afterwards, right? Shuvlo tizakek liyibum, kivin sheniftra sha'achas. There's a din of nasra because this is where he says, doesn't say this in the Gemara, mishum shenemar dracha darchei Noah. That the prohibition, that the din rather of nasra is based on the principle in Mishlei of dracha, that the Torah's ways are nice or pleasant. The Gemara later on Pei Zayin Amud Beis does apply dracha darchei Noam to exclude a certain case from Yibum. That is true, but it's not a Nasra case. We'll see. We'll look at it. Right? Kid Amar Perak Daladachim, Kol Yavama Shainani Kore, but Shas Nefila, Yavama, Yavolea, Arekesha Si, Shesh Labanim Basura, Danes of Darkei Noah. Im Yeshli is Dake Klazesh, and Nifter Menu. If you have to keep, you were exempt from this person, and then all of a sudden their status changes, it's just too confusing. And you never. You can never have closure.
So everybody agrees that's for the Rabbanan maximally.
No, he doesn't think it's Rabbanan. He thinks it's Doraisa, but he thinks that it's Doraisa based on the sensitivity of not having a serious closure. Everything keeps opening up again. Aval nida darchi noam he dilabala nami trichalahamtin ad shetataher. The Rabbi cut on the Kaman also. Nida. Her husband has to wait in terms of heterisha labala also until she goes to the mikvah. That's not dracha. That's not a problem with dracha darchei noam. But the idea that all of Nasra is based on dracha darchei noam, that is a chiddush. Rabbi the Parrot says it even more explicitly on Daf Tes Amud Aleph. And I want to talk about that a little bit next time. Meaning, talk a little bit more about Nida being an erva, and I want to talk about dracha darchei noam, because this idea of dracha darchei noam appears in a few Gemaras, and the Bali Tosas expand its significance in Yibum, which is one of the Gemaras where the Gemara speaks about it.
And it comes from
also find it in regard to the Dalet Minim in Sukkah and Lulav, in other words. And I want to discuss why I think it's in these places and not so much in other places.
And its source comes from Mishlei?
The pasuk of dracha darchei noam v'kol nesiv aseh shalom is a pasuk in Mishlei.
So we'll do that next week.
They don't mean that that's the makar of this specifically. They mean that shows a certain, derech.
Because if we say it's a deraisa, we would not use necessarily Mishlei as a source, would we?
Right, but they don't mean it as a gilui milsa from Mishlei directly. They mean the sensibility that's described in Mishlei.
It's reflecting on a Torah precept.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we'll stop here. And Hashem will finish up with this and move on to Sota, also a very interesting topic. Hashem next week.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Have a good night.
I have a question, if I might.
Yeah, go ahead.
I thought the workaround for a woman in Nida was that the woman simply has to hold her finger up and the man has to drop the ring onto it without touching her. Wouldn't that solve the problem?
Oh, you mean in terms of in sort of the Kedushin of Anida?
Yeah.
Yeah, that people do that. But what they're saying is that, that's what the Maggid Mishnah is saying is, let's say somebody's not careful about that. He's saying, oh, you have to be careful about that. So it's ein roy. Try not to get, if she's a nida, wait and try not to get yourself in that position.
Thank
He's
you.
not saying it's impossible to avoid. He's saying you have to be careful, and some people are not careful, and therefore, like, you don't want to embarrass somebody. It's nobody else's business, what, the physical status of the kala is at the time of the wedding. That's why when there is a chuppah nida, and it happens, even now that you can, regulate, these things, medically much more easily. There are still cases of chuppah nida, but it typically try to do it in a very tsanua way because it's really nobody else's business. So to try to do it in a way that is both private and yet operating according to the rigorous standards of the halacha, can be a little difficult, although it's totally doable in exactly what you just said. That's why the Magen Mishnah thinks the Rambam says ein roy, meaning why better to avoid because some people aren't careful. But you're totally right. You're totally right. Okay. Have a great week, everyone.
Thank you.